We started the series Reconstructing the Bible with a pretty simple affirmation of what the Bible is. We said the Bible is a collection of writings. It's an anthology, a library of diverse sources, and many of them were written by different authors at different times to different audiences in different languages and styles and genres with different themes and emphases that the authors were wanting to develop, which resulted in different theologies and ethics emerging from these writings. And from this starting point, we considered the broad scope of the Bible, specifically in terms of when the books of the Bible were produced and the different culturally embedded snapshots of God and the world and faith that they therefore contained. Within the Bible, we have texts that span a time frame of about 1,300 years, so it makes sense that their messages would be rooted in really different and also really specific cultural moments, situations, and circumstances. I think that we sometimes miss that, and as a result, we miss some of the development of ideas that takes place within the Bible, and that can be problematic when we import everything that we think back onto the pages of Scripture, sort of indiscriminately of its context. Now here I want to go back to the same starting point. The Bible is a library of diverse sources written by different authors at different times to different audiences and different languages, styles, genres with different themes and emphases and different theologies and ethics that are emerging from these writings. But I want to use these facts to talk about another important correlate. Because of the Bible's diversity of material, when we approach its stories or its laws, its poetry, its prophecy, whatever it is, we have to use different reading strategies to make sense of these texts. Now, we usually do this intuitively in our context because we read a shopping list differently than we do an op-ed, and we read poetry differently than we do a legal contract. But it's much more difficult when we're dealing with ancient literature, but it's certainly no less important. We should absolutely read a book like Genesis differently than we would the Song of Songs with its Egyptian-inspired and super graphic love poetry. We should also approach the prophetic book of Isaiah differently than we would the Gospel of Matthew or Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church. To varying degrees, these are different types of literature that demand different approaches. If you wanted to get technical, we could even say that comparing whole books is sort of wrong-headed because a book like Genesis or Isaiah or Matthew, it contains multiple genres within. So even in a given book, you have to be intentional about knowing what type of literature you're reading, because here's the deal. If we mislabel something, or if we start from the wrong place with the wrong expectations, we're going to misread it. Have you ever seen those fake movie trailers that take a comedy like Mrs. Doubtfire or Dumb and Dumber, and somebody decides to recut it so that it looks like a horror movie? It's got this ominous voiceover and this creepy music, and it just makes it seem like it's a completely different type of movie, different genre of movie. And when you start with the wrong category, you're going to misunderstand the whole thing. Now let's see how this might work with a text. Within the Gospels, the stories of Jesus' ministry, his sermons, his miracles, the meals that he shares with his friends, the general recounting of his life, those are all a different type of literature than his parables. The stories of Jesus' ministry are, generally speaking, biographical writings. We might say historical writings, even though that term is loaded with all sorts of assumptions when we compare ancient history to our more modern conception of what history must entail. But it's different than parables. Parables are clearly fictional. They're intended to teach. They're not recounting historical events as if there was really a Samaritan one time and he really was walking on the Jericho Road and then he really saw a guy who had really been beaten up and left for dead. That's not how parables work. So if you're reading a parable as history, you're going to misunderstand it. If you have a parable that's recut as a historical event, you're going to go in the wrong direction. Now, this example came up last week, so I've been thinking about it, and I know you probably weren't thinking, hey, let's talk about the afterlife, particularly the bit about suffering. But you know what? Here we are, and besides, talking about hell never got anybody in trouble, right? Right? In Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells this story. He says, there was a certain rich man who clothed himself in purple and fine linen and feasted luxuriously every day. There's a couple of important points that we see here. The clothes that the rich man is wearing, the fact that he is feasting luxuriously every day. And this is going to be contrasted from this next character. At his gate, it says, lay a certain poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. No mention of clothes, and we continue to see what this man is wanting to eat. It says Lazarus longed to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Instead, dogs would come and lick his sores. The reference here to dogs shouldn't be taken as super cute companions. Dogs were scavengers. One commentator calls them pariah-like mongrels that roamed the outskirts of town in search of refuse. Dogs in the Bible, they're held in contempt. Verse 22, the poor man died and was carried by angels to Abraham's side. This is weird for this particular cultural moment to have angels carrying someone to Abraham's side. The rich man, it says, also died and was buried. Note the contrast. The rich man is buried. That's important. The poor man is not. That's important. While being tormented in the place of the dead, he looked up and saw Abraham at a distance with Lazarus at his side, and he shouted, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm suffering in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, whereas Lazarus received terrible things. Now Lazarus is being comforted and you are in great pain. Moreover, a great crevasse has been fixed between us and you. Note the us and you. Those who wish to cross from here to there cannot. Neither can anyone cross from there to us. The rich man said, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers, and they need to be warned. He needs to warn them so that they don't come to this place of agony. And Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them. And the rich man said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone will go from the dead to them, they will change their hearts and lives. And Abraham again says, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead. Okay, clearly, this is a parable. Admittedly, though, it's a weird one. Parables don't usually have people with proper names in them, but some of the telltale literary signs are there. This story is meant to teach us something. First, there's a pretty classic reversal of fortunes story at work here. The poor man receives rewards, whereas the rich man receives punishment. Second, notice how the rich man in the story still thinks of himself as better than Lazarus. Even though he's dead and suffering, he is still treating Lazarus as one would treat a servant or someone that's not quite up to their status. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and bring it to me. Send Lazarus to my brothers to warn them. Nothing has changed in the rich man's mindset. Lazarus is still the one who is seen as a servant. Lazarus should do the rich man's bidding. And this all leads Abraham to say in the parable, if your family doesn't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be persuaded by someone who rises from the dead. Nothing will shake your family out of this mindset. Much like even death and suffering apparently have not shaken you out of your classist Lazarus is my servant mindset. As I. Howard Marshall writes, miracles in themselves cannot melt stony hearts. There are points to ponder here in this story, points that will stick with you, which is sort of the MO of a parable. It gets lodged into your brain. In fact, if you connect this story with what precedes, it's clear that Jesus is addressing the Pharisees with this story. They have been complaining about the sort of company that he keeps and his hospitality towards others and his care and concern for the outcasts. And then he launches into this story about a rich guy who doesn't get it and won't get it, even though it's clear in Moses and the prophets. Now, here's something the story is not trying to do. It is not trying to teach us about the literal realities of the afterlife. That's to push the image too far. That's to make the parable do too much. It's to make the parable too specific. Another New Testament scholar, Darrell Bock, writes, "It is graphic and pictorial, and it reflects a reality rather than describing it literally." And I'm not sure that we realize how often this is the case. Something similar happens, for example, all throughout the Gospels when Jesus describes things, like when he describes the kingdom. He uses images and word pictures for what the kingdom of God is. He says it's like a net, a bush, a seed, a pearl. It's like some coins. These are not literal descriptions. They are graphic and pictorial, and they reflect a reality, but not a literal reality, or not a literal reality literally. That made sense to Jesus' audience, and that makes sense to us too. But what about this? When Jesus describes hell, or better, Gehenna, which is the word he often uses for hell, he also is using points of comparison. He says it's like the Valley of Hinnom. It's the site where kids were sacrificed. It's the site that was declared unclean by Josiah in the Old Testament in the midst of his reform, and that subsequently was turned into a trash heap. That place has become an image of judgment. Sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on the image and not the underlying reality, and we end up missing the point. And here's where this usually goes. Because we tend to live in the world of all or nothing. If I say something like I just have said to Christians, maybe I say, the passages are doing something different than describing a literal reality literally, then someone might reach the conclusion, well, I guess Josh doesn't believe in hell. Because in the minds of a good number of people, it's all or nothing. The Bible is, for example, 100% historical, or it's 100% bunch of made-up nonsense. The Bible is 100% literal, or it's 100% up to us to do whatever we want to do with it. The Bible is 100% inspired, or it's 100% human. The Bible is 100% inerrant, or it's 100% filled with lies. Now, I get where this mindset comes from, but remember, we're dealing with an ancient collection of diverse sources written by different authors at different times, to different audiences and different languages and styles and genres, with different themes and emphases that the authors want to or need to develop, which resulted in different theologies and ethics emerging from these writings. We cannot reduce the Bible in all of that diversity to either ors. We cannot reduce it to 100% this or 100% that. Because how we read one text is very different than how we read other texts, just like how we read a shopping list is very different than how we read an op-ed. I hear this either-or comparison most often when discussing the book of Jonah. And I know, I talk about Jonah a lot. Too much, probably, but it's just such an easy example. And honestly, we should talk about it, because these are the sorts of conversations that you might have, and I want you to approach them thoughtfully. So, Jonah. I read Jonah as a piece of short theological fiction that was probably written pretty late in the game. And I do this because it doesn't act like other prophetic books. Robert Alter says it tells a story altogether unlike those of earlier biblical literature. Think about it. The prophet runs away. Jonah is the only prophet called to go to a foreign territory. In fact, Jonah doesn't address any Israelites in the story at all. The story also is just pretty insane. And here, I don't just mean that Jonah was living in the belly of a great fish for 3 days. I mean that the animals are wearing sackcloth and participating in a religious fast while repenting. The animals! The depiction of God is also kind of weird because the book is universalist in its approach. Like, this is about the Ninevites being forgiven. We could call all of this satire because Jonah is a terrible prophet. We could call this midrash because it's a story that seems to be attempting to explain God's goodness. At the very end, Jonah says, I knew that you were going to do this. I knew that you were going to forgive them. And then goes in to describe God as the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, from the so-called divine revelation in Exodus 34. In other words, this entire story seems to be crafted around this one idea of describing who God is. Notice, my reason for reading Jonah figuratively has nothing to do with whether or not miracles can happen. It's all the other stuff. The story, it just seems to be screaming out to us, this isn't historical. But for most people, when I say things like that, it quickly becomes linked with Jesus. Well, if Jonah didn't happen, how do we know Jesus happened? And this connection is altogether inappropriate because the Bible includes a diversity of material. So when we approach its stories, its laws, its poetry, its prophecy, whatever it is, we have to use different reading strategies. So my views on Jonah should not therefore be linked to my views on Jesus, because the Gospels are doing very different things than this weirdo book of prophecy that is sort of unlike any other book of prophecy that we have in the Old Testament. Yet we do this sort of thing where we have either ors. Either the Bible is 100% this or it's 100% that. So when a person reads Jonah in one way, it seems to have some link to how they read other stories, but it shouldn't. Now, the payoff for this, the payoff for us understanding that the Bible is diverse and we should employ different reading strategies might be that some of the problematic texts that we have in our Bibles, we can deal with them a bit more fairly because we would employ the correct and proper reading strategy to understand what it's saying, instead of starting from the wrong place and leading at the wrong conclusion, which makes for really problematic theologies and ethics. Now, this is not to say that the Bible will be devoid of those throughout, because the Bible is ancient literature that is sometimes very difficult for us to understand. But we certainly will begin from the right place when we employ the right reading strategies for each particular text that we are looking at. And I would commend that to you for a point of consideration when you begin to read the Bible as well.